Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a story we all think we know inside and out, the American Revolution. You know the classic picture, right? We usually imagine it playing out in this neat little vacuum. Brave colonists, some tea tossed in a harbor, redcoats marching in lines, and boom, a brand new nation is born. But when we actually dig into the historical data, the original documents, and the global shockwaves it caused, a completely different narrative emerges. It turns out this is a story that stretches way, way beyond those original 13 colonies. To really grasp this era, we have to completely reframe the revolution. As one historical analysis puts it, what begins as a political clash between colonists and the British government grows into a bloody struggle that will engage more than 24 nations and forever change the world. It absolutely wasn't just a localized dispute over taxes. It evolved into a massive, sprawling global conflict.
Section 1. A World Turned Upside Down, the Hidden Global War.
Okay, so the popular myth paints this really romanticized picture of ragtag American farmers standing all alone against the mighty British monarchy. But the reality was actually a massive global proxy war. France and Spain eventually jumped into the fray, the Dutch got heavily involved, and the British weren't just fighting battles across the Atlantic. They were actually dealing with brutal civil unrest and some deep, deep divisions right back home in the British Isles. This revolution really left no one unscathed, literally pitching neighbor against neighbor across multiple continents.
Honestly, without external help, the whole American experiment might have just been a really short footnote in history. Their survival relied heavily on a massive French covert operation, and it's wild how it started. They actually used a fake Dutch gazette just to shift French public opinion. Then, a playwright named Pierre Beaumarchais set up a literal shell company called Rodrigue Hortolese Company to smuggle gunpowder to the Patriots. It sounds like a movie, but the impact was staggering. By the time of the pivotal Battle of Saratoga, up to 90% of the American arms were actually supplied by the French. Militarily, it was French Admiral de Grasse's fleet that ultimately trapped the British at Yorktown. But, this victory came at an immense cost. The war cost France over 1 billion livres, a debt that severely crippled its own finances and, ironically, helped spark the French Revolution just a few years later.
Section 2. Declaring Independence, the True Audience of 1776. So knowing all this about the global stage, it really forces us to step back and ask, what did the Declaration of Independence actually, declare? We instantly think of individual rights, but historically speaking, the document had a very specific practical job to do. Today, our popular focus is almost entirely on the middle of the document, those beautiful domestic ideals and individual rights. All men are created equal. But historically, the intent of the first and last paragraphs was entirely different. It was all about state-making and sovereignty. The founders were basically writing a legal plea to the powers of the earth. They were officially saying, hey, we are no longer rebels, we are an independent state capable of making alliances and fighting a war. It was essentially an international distress flare aimed squarely at countries like France. Because of this, historians often argue it's perhaps better understood as a declaration of interdependence. To gain independence from Britain, the new nation had to legally declare its independence within the global state system. They needed to formally join the Club of Nations so they could legally sign treaties and, crucially, secure that desperately needed French gunpowder. Section 3. The Great Contradiction: Ideals versus Reality. Now, we have to look at one of the most profound contradictions in modern history. The ideal, of course, was all men are created equal, a completely radical, egalitarian statement for the 18th century, authored by Thomas Jefferson. But the reality? Jefferson owned roughly 150 enslaved people at the exact moment he was drafting those very words. The foundational rhetoric of universal liberty existed side by side with the grim, undeniable reality of human bondage. To really understand how deeply entrenched this contradiction was, you just have to look at the hard data. $2 billion. That was the total economic value of enslaved people in the United States in 1860. To put that massive number into perspective for us today, that is the equivalent of $5.5 trillion. Let that sink in for a second. That $2 billion value of enslaved people was actually greater than the value of all U.S. railroads and banks combined at the time. The institution of slavery wasn't just some regional issue. It was the single most valuable asset in the entire American economic and political system, outside of the land itself. Antebellum America was fundamentally shaped by this immense economic engine, which directly contradicted the very ideals they broadcast to the world back in 1776. Section 4. A Contagion of Sovereignty: The Global Fallout. Despite those contradictions,
The idea of a single written national constitution became this radical, explosive export. The United States sparks it in 1787, drawing on the spirit of 1776. But the blueprint rapidly jumped borders. The idea spread like wildfire. Poland adopted its first written constitution in 1791. France followed later that exact same year. By 1804, following its own successful revolution, Haiti ratified its constitution. The American example truly triggered a massive global wave of constitution making.
This contagion of sovereignty was especially potent just to the south. Get this, over 100 declarations of independence have been issued globally since 1776, with many of those in Latin America. Initially, U.S. leaders celebrated these new Latin American republics. They called them Southern Brethren, following in the footsteps of George Washington. But the historical sources reveal a fascinating and much darker shift. By 1846, U.S. rhetoric shifted dramatically to actually justify the invasion of the independent Republic of Mexico. The U.S. went from celebrating its revolutionary neighbors to engaging in imperialist ventures, largely driven by manifest destiny. This expansionism directly contradicted those espoused principles of Republican democracy, showing how a nation born out of an anti-imperialist revolution eventually began exhibiting imperial behaviors of its own.
Section 5. The Fading Blueprint. A Constitutional Legacy in Decline.
Now, let's fast forward to today. When we compare the U.S. Constitution to the modern global average, a really stark contrast emerges. In the last 50 years, the U.S. Constitution has been amended exactly one time, just once. Meanwhile, the average global constitution has a 38% chance of being revised every single year. The U.S. document is over 230 years old, whereas the average modern constitution is completely replaced about every 19 years. So the U.S. framework is incredibly static compared to the highly evolutionary, adaptable constitutions around the rest of the world today.
Which brings us to this incredibly powerful conclusion from a 2012 University of Virginia study that analyzed 729 global constitutions. They noted, no evolutionary process favors a species that is frozen in time. The data strongly suggests that the U.S. Constitution is actually losing its global appeal. During the 1980s and 90s, the world's newly formed constitutions heavily mirrored the U.S. model. But today, constitution makers are largely looking elsewhere, simply because the American model is seen as so rigid and difficult to adapt to modern, fast-changing needs.
So it leaves us with this final thought. If a constitution is frozen in time, can it still lead the future? We've seen how a global proxy war literally birthed the nation, how a Declaration of Independence reshaped the globe, and how a contagion of sovereignty inspired millions, even amidst some profound domestic contradictions. But as the world rapidly evolves today, the long-term viability of the American experiment's original blueprint on the world stage remains a massive, open question. Thank you for joining me for this explainer as we uncovered the true global story of 1776.